Well, a very good morning, afternoon, evening, depending on wherever you are in the world. My name is Adrian Reed, and a very warm welcome to this BA Community webinar. I'm really pleased to say that today we are joined by Dr. Penny Pullan, who will be talking about a topic that I'm sure is very relevant for many of us within the BA and other communities. We're going to hear about virtual leadership today. Now, I've actually known Penny for a number of years, and actually, Penny, before the webinar, I was trying to work out where we first met, and I'm pretty sure it was the BA Conference 2009, and I can still remember you telling some really interesting stories about virtual working. So I was really pleased that you're able to join us today. So with a presentation entitled Virtual Leadership, how BAs can work effectively when their teams and stakeholders aren't where they are. Over to you, Penny.
Well, thanks very much. And I do remember in 2009, the talk that I gave. What I'm going to do is I'm going to be drawing during this session. I don't know if many of the participants have actually seen this before, but I find it really effective to not just have the slides themselves, but actually to make some annotations and drawings. And as you can see from the picture, I do like doing things visually. So yeah, why me? What am I doing here? I suppose the thing is that I've been really focused on success in tricky projects. And one of the key things about tricky, one of the big elements of tricky, has been virtual. For me, tricky started, just over 16 years ago, this tricky virtual side of projects. I was due to fly to New York. Everything was ready. My bags are packed. My boarding passes are printed. Everything was ready to go. What could possibly go wrong? The trouble is that the date on my boarding pass was the 13th of September, 2001. And of course, 2 days before 9/11 happened. And so I could not fly. And instead of kicking off a major program in New York, I stayed at home and I had to run everything virtually, which was a bit like being thrown in the deep end of a swimming pool, really. But luckily it worked. And I've been working as a BA and a project program manager, and more recently as a consultant, using virtual and with teams of people all around the world for a long time now. So virtually for the past 16 years, probably on projects 20, actually probably a little bit more than that now. I've written a few books as well, and I'm writing another one, but that's me. I've worked all around the world. That's probably enough. So let's keep going. So there you are. Those are those books. So those tricky projects I mentioned. Virtual teams is something that really makes things tricky. Obviously, risk is part of it. Ambiguous, changing requirements, disengaged stakeholders. So I work with things that help with all of those. If we were in a room together, you'd probably be getting involved and trying things out in an experiential way like this. This is one from a year or two ago. But unfortunately, we're not. So those sort of games are not part of today. But we will be doing lots of fun stuff and hopefully things that will be helpful as well. So let's try the first thing then, which is this visual template. I'm just going to use it to introduce the session today. And again, you can see I'm switching over to using a pen, and I'll just be marking some things as we go through. So if you do run a virtual session, it's incredibly important to be very clear and structured so that people know where they are, what they're doing. And this is a template that I like to use for virtual sessions as well as face-to-face sessions. So what we've got here is the first question in the middle where I'm drawing the red dot. What are we here to do today? What are you spending some time out to do? And it's to explore virtual leadership. So that's what you're interested in. Explore virtual leadership for BAs. Then you're in the right place. What are we going to do today? Well, today we will introduce me, introduce virtual, and we'll also find out a little bit about all of you who are here as well. We'll look at being authentic, which is an important part of being a virtual leader, really being authentic and coming across as you. The way that we connect virtually with other people we don't connect like machines. We use the machines, we use the technology to provide the way that the means to connect, but we connect as authentic human beings, and that's what will make your work as a BA so much easier if you can connect to people authentically. We'll also look at engaging people, which is one of the key problems when you're working virtually. We'll look at what happens when you add the complexity of culture, of language, of big time zones, and so on. And then we'll also have a chance to look at your action plan. So our time plan today, coming over to the top left, we started, I think, pretty much bang on at 12:30. We'll keep going until round about 1:10, where there'll be Q&A. Well, when I finish, we'll go through questions and answers. I'm aiming for about 1:10. That might change a little bit. And we will be finished at the latest by 1:30, and these are all UK times. So who's doing what? Well, I'm here facilitating, I suppose presenting as well. We've got Adrian hosting, and we've got all of you as participants. So please think of yourself as a participant, and there'll be some things that you can do as we go through. Don't think of yourself as somebody just sitting there watching. It's not like the TV. We'd like to have your input. So how are we going to work together? Another important thing to ask about in virtual sessions, and to set up those group norms as to how you're going to work together. So I'm going to suggest that please do send through questions. Use the chat box. Pop your questions up as we go. Some webinar people don't like having things coming in as they're talking. I absolutely love it, because then I can tweak things to flex and answer your questions. So do send through questions, comments, thoughts as we go. And do be involved. This is not like watching TV. Please get involved, and then this session will be as good as it can be for you. What's happening next? Well, we don't have anything planned for this particular webinar. This is just a one-off, but there will be some other things that you can do afterwards that you'll find out later. Okay, so as there are no questions in the chat, I'm going to move on and say, first thing we need to know is actually, what do we mean by virtual? Because we talk about it all the time. And I would say that you have a virtual team that you're working with if at least one person is remote from the rest. If at least one person is away from the others, then you should treat your team as virtual and use the sort of leadership techniques that we talk about in this session. What normally happens is that if there's one person who's away, and then there are a group of people who are all in a room together, the people in a room treat the huddle in the room as the meeting. And the remote person, more often than not, gets forgotten about. So instead, don't do this. Have a level playing field where everybody has the same access. So if at least one person is remote from the others, that's what I call a virtual team. That's where you need virtual leadership. Okay, so now I've introduced myself, I've introduced the session today, and I've introduced the term virtual. I'm going to hand over to you and ask some questions. I think Adrian has some polls ready to go.
Yep. So I'm just activating the first poll now.
So what's your current role? Are you a business analyst, a business analysis manager, a project or program manager, or something else? If you choose other, just pop your role in the chat box so I can see the mix of who's on the line and tailor the things that we cover a little bit to fit. Okay, interesting. So we have business analysts at 86%. We have one business analysis manager and no project or program managers at all. So I don't have to worry about things from that perspective. And we have somebody who's a BDM stroke BA. So that's very useful. Right. Thank you very much for that. So another question, now you know what we're doing and you know how to go about doing the poll. Let's ask the next one. How many virtual projects are you involved with right now? Ah, that's interesting. So we've got some people with no virtual projects at the moment, a few with one. We've got most people have 2 to 4. Now that's a sensible number. 5 to 9, there's one person with that, and nobody with 10 or more. That makes sense. I once did this with project managers, and somebody had 19 concurrent projects, which I thought, how can you manage so many projects, let alone when they're virtual? Thanks, Adrian, for that. That's helpful. So the next question that we have is, what proportion of your working week is spent working virtually? Okay, so we've got, nobody or none. 1 to 5 hours, there's just one person. The biggest number is at 5 to 15 hours. And there's also quite a few at 15 to 30 hours. And there are a couple of people who spend 30 hours or more working virtually. Okay, thank you for that. So you're quite serious virtual workers in this group. Okay. The final question is, what are your main challenges to virtual leadership? What are the main things that are tricky for you? There are a few sample ideas given here, using technology, engaging remote participants, detecting and dealing with conflict, monitoring work done, but there can be many, many more. So if your main challenges are something else, please just type them into the chat and then we'll be able to get a view of what's important for you. Engaging remote participants. Absolutely. It always comes out top. And isn't it interesting? Using the technology, absolutely nobody has a problem with that. But we're BAs, so I can understand that. Detecting and dealing with conflict has a couple. We've got some interesting things coming in the chat. So Emma's saying changing from predominantly office-based team to virtual. That change is one that's happening quite a bit. Challenges with language, absolutely. Monitoring remote work, ensuring that remote workers are actively involved. It's sort of related to people being engaged as well. Okay, thank you very much. Lots of interesting input there. So you won't be too surprised then if I go through the survey results. These are from, it's actually a couple of years ago now. I did a big survey just in the run up to my virtual leadership book. A lot of these people were BAs, project managers, mainly project people, and some others. As you can see from the word cloud here, the majority of the people that did the survey came from the UK. We had quite a few people from around Europe. We had some from the Middle East and some from the US, Australia, and New Zealand. Okay, so let's have a look at the sort of organizations they were in. Well, as you can imagine, with project type people, there are a lot of people from big companies. There were some from it was either big companies, you can see here, or small companies down here. Lots work for multinational organizations and predominantly private sector. I did have some public sector and NGO input. So going through and looking at the results, you're not going to be at all surprised at the top challenge. Engaging remote participants. This is one thing that 3/4 of the people who did the survey said was a big challenge. And of course it is. I do love these pictures that I'm about to show you. But this one, doesn't it just sum up many of the virtual meetings that exist nowadays? And just in case you're thinking that it's just a problem that women face, finding virtual meetings boring, Here's a picture of a man. So below engaging remote participants, the things that came up in my survey, and I didn't have all of these in your options: missing out dynamics and nuances of conversation, working across time zones, working across cultures, building trust remotely. That was another one as well that was important. The next level down, I won't go through all of them, but monitoring work done, conflict, understanding, meaning different things, like project managers and business analysts sometimes mean different things with the same word, like scope, for example. Yeah, so quite a few things. I asked people what worked for them as well, and these are the answers. So things like, the key thing that people suggested was meeting face-to-face, really. So I'll just mark that. That was the one that people really said helped virtual teams, actually having met people. That's not always available. But if you can do it at the start of the project once a year or once every 6 months, then it does seem to make a difference. Using some sort of structure for your meetings is help. Clear roles and responsibilities, so you know who is doing what. Regular clear communication without big gaps, time to get to know each other, don't just rush into your projects, get to know each other. Understanding other team members' perspectives and how they prefer to work. Use video over audio so you can get to know each other. I've noticed the term face-to-face seems to be moving into meaning video calls, because face-to-face used to mean present in the same room. The technology needs to be easy to use and up to the job, but once you've got that, all the other things aren't about technology. An open team culture can be really helpful, where each person is listened to, and this thing down here, able to ask for help. In some places, people feel uncomfortable about asking for help. Common repository, somewhere where you can access everything and that everyone has the same level of access and ease of access. Shared vision, outcomes and purpose. Widespread use of screen sharing technology, as we're doing today. And then there's one thing that was split between participants. About half said the telephone was absolutely vital, being able to catch up with people one-to-one. And the other half said instant message was something that they couldn't live without. I didn't have an age profile on the survey, but I wonder if it's anything like our family. The parents, so my husband and I really like the phone, and my kids hardly ever use it and really like instant message. So these are things that people said were particularly useful. Yeah, and being clear on how you work together as well. So we've covered those things. Right. So let's just check where we are. So we've done the introduction. We've sort of shown you the survey. So what we're going to do now is just look at being authentic and being a leader. So the first step of this is to have a look at my virtual leadership model. Now, I did think about drawing it up for you, but using this pen in PowerPoint, you can do this too, by the way. If you go to PowerPoint, just go down to the bottom left-hand screen and you'll be able to draw with a pen. You can use your mouse. I'm actually using a Intuos graphics tablet. So let's just go through the leadership model from my book. So the first level, the middle one, the core, is leadership of yourself. And that's the first thing to look at. And we're going to look at that first of all. And that's the first thing to work on. And then we're going to look at the next stage out, which is being able to work effectively with others. Then at that next stage, then we bring in the technology. We bring in virtual meetings, where you have people meeting separated, but also what do you do in between meetings? People often forget about in between meetings. Then we'll look at adding in the complexity, those time zones, the different cultures, the different generations even, as we saw from the instant message and the telephone, and then language and what happens to language. So we're going to be sort of using that in the background. That's my virtual leadership model. So someone who's an authentic virtual leader on a project needs to start with themselves. They need to really be clear on their mindset. What is it that they're doing? If you want to work effectively with your virtual colleagues, choose to be a virtual leader. That doesn't mean to say that you're going to be at the front with lots of people following you. It's about making the choice to serve and to put the effort in to develop the skills you need to do this really well. Understand things about yourself, and we'll look at what those are shortly. Know what your skills are and develop the ones that you need, and be aware of your own identity so that you can then be authentic as you connect with others and find common ground. So let's have a bit more of a look at those 4 things. So here we are. We've got your leadership mindset that we've just talked about. So what you don't want when you're a virtual leader, you don't want to be a sort of command and control type leader. I think BAs are less likely to do this than some others. Command and control, very directive leadership doesn't really work very well virtually because people are likely to disengage. So it's very much a sort of facilitative leadership that I see working really well when you are virtual. If you've got comments and thoughts, please do pop these in the chat, and that will help us as we go along. So what about understanding? What are the parts that you need to understand? Well, you need to understand yourself. Things like your personality. There are lots of different ways you can do that to understand what makes you tick and the ways you prefer to work. Understanding your own biases, obviously they're subconscious or unconscious. There are ways that maybe you can ask other people to work with you to help understanding what your biases are. What are your preferences? What are the ways you prefer to work virtually, for example, and other preferences? Do you prefer the phone? Are you an instant message? Do you prefer to be updated many times, or perhaps just at the end once people have finished work? What are your strengths that you can build on and that you can use to serve your team? What are the weak areas where you need other people with strengths in those areas so you can balance out? So you need to understand, how do you relate to other people so that you can make the most of those relationships? What about your skills for virtual leadership? You need to be a pretty good listener, or you wouldn't get very far. You need to be able to use the technology. As we've seen, the BAs on this call and others have no problems with the technology. That's not come up as a big deal. You need to know how to engage people, and this is the biggest thing. Engaging remote participants, hardest thing that came up. You need to be fairly organized to be a virtual leader. Adrian and I were talking about our desks just before we went to broadcast, and we don't have the most organized desks, but we are organized and structured when we come to doing things virtually. And you need to be able to collaborate with others. For identity, we're going to need a little bit more of a look. Do send things through the chat if you've got any questions. We're going to dive in now into some information which I found in a book. In fact, let me just move this on. This is found in a book by a lady called Priya Abraham called CyberConnecting, and the name is on the next slide. So we have various aspects of our identity, our tangible aspects and intangible. Let's move on. So you can see the name of the book down there at the bottom. CyberConnecting, here we go, by Priya Abraham. She's an anthropologist looking at the virtual world, which I found fascinating. Your tangible identity aspects are all those things that if you're with somebody in a room, they will see straight away your appearance, your ethnicity, your gender, the generation that you belong to. And those things will be very powerful. They will show your identity very quickly. If you're virtual, though, these things aren't so visible immediately. And you can play more with the intangible. And this is a great way of finding the ways to connect with others. So which of these are important to you? So for example, your geopolitics in the world at the moment, you may well, I'm sure you have particular beliefs, and if you can find people with similar ones that you can connect to in your virtual team, that can be helpful. Of course, if you have very different geopolitical beliefs, it might be better to focus on other ones. So for example, lifelong learning is one that I use quite a bit when I'm working with the Middle East, because that's a real key thing for me, that I like reading, learning, going to courses, developing myself. And that's something that I found to be very strong there as well. So looking at these different elements, how can you connect with others as well? Know yourself first, and then you'll be able to do that connection. So what we're going to look at next is working with others. So we need to know all these things, have the right mindset, understand ourselves, but also understand the other people's personality, bias, preferences, strengths and weaknesses, so you can blend a team that will work together. Others on your virtual team will also need to have the skills of listening, technology, and so on. And you can use your identity and understand each other's identity to find overlaps and where you have common ground. If you can create common ground, then it's a first step to working together in a team. Okay, I suspect quite a bit of that is quite new to people. So do let me know in the chat what you, how you're finding it. I found it very useful when I saw it initially. We're going to be moving on in a moment. I'm going to be looking at some of the other aspects, for example, engaging people and how we can use technology effectively. So I'm going to just skip ahead to here. Technology options. You have a lot of different options. But just before I go into that, I'm going to come over. I can see that Kemi's asking, how do you remain facilitative and not edge into command and control when you need people to get things done, especially if you're accountable, but they're responsible? So I think the key thing is just remember that command and control, being very directive, is actually, while it may work when people are together in a crisis situation, when you're virtual, what I've seen is that it tends to make people disengage even more. So if you've had experience of it not working and doing other things, then that's helpful, as I have. So I suppose if you need to get people to get things done, the best way is to listen to them, to connect with them, get them engaged and interested, and agree together when something will be done. And also, of course, take your cultural differences into account as well. You may think that being directive and shouting and things will get things done more quickly. It might possibly do the first time, but it may cause irrevocable damage to your relationship if you're over directive and you're unlikely to get people engaging. Right, let's go to technology now. But if other people have comments, do send them through if you'd like to. So this grid is quite a useful way of splitting up different technologies. You'll notice that the top row is all about things in the same place. So this would be standard in-room meetings. Same time, same place. Different time, same place would be things like notice boards. So people can wander up and see the information at different times. I think a lot of people use Agile, or using Agile will have a lot of visual boards that people can look at different times, but they're in the same physical place. The bottom row are the things that are in the different place. So of course, you've got the same time, different place, like this webinar. We're using the technology that's supporting same time, different place. If you're watching this as a recording later on, then that's different time, different place. So think about what's the appropriate technology for your virtual sessions. So webinar, telephone, I suppose we'd call that conference calls, wouldn't we? Video conference, and so on. Skype would be in here as well. So you can see there are all sorts of technologies for live meetings, but there are also lots for different time, different place. And this is where, especially if you have wide time zones, you can really, if you can move work across into here, it makes it much easier for people to do it at a convenient time for them. So things like forums, blogs, wikis, just collaboration software in general. You can do a lot of work without having to do stuff at the same time, which is useful as well. So think about what's the appropriate technology for your work. The big question that you've all been waiting for is engaging people. What works? So the big reveal is coming. Well, this is just 3 of the things that work. I think I've got about 4 or 5 pages about this inside the book, Virtual Leadership. So I hope you're noticing some of these things. So visuals. I hope you're noticing that me actually drawing, even if sometimes it doesn't go quite round the word, that some of these drawings are helping to draw you in, both the slides that have visual information on them, but also the fact that I'm creating some pictures as you go. So there you are. There's a visual. What else works? Faces. Faces are very powerful. Can you use people's faces to connect with each other? So something that I'll show you in a moment is having a map with everybody in the team, all their faces superimposed on where they are in the world. That's quite useful for keeping people engaged and working out where they are. This one you might not have been expecting, the narrative form, telling things in a story-like way. And I'm going to give you a bit of a challenge, because I used a story earlier on, a true story, about how I started working virtually. If you can remember the date that I was due to fly to New York, please could you type it into the chat? I won't use your names at all. Just type the date in and let's see. Oh, and before I've even finished the answer, somebody's come in with the 13th of September. Does anyone remember the year? Oh, more people saying 13th of September, 2001, absolutely. Do you know why you remembered that so well? The reason is that I was using a story form. I was telling it in a narrative form. And if you use story as opposed to just giving things in lists, you'll find that the people who are listening, their brains will sort of automatically hook in. Our brains have been honed to capture stories and remember them incredibly well, and to pass that down. And over many generations, for thousands of years, that was the main way of passing information down the generations. Audio stories, spoken stories, passed on. So our brains are very good at remembering stories. They're also very good at taking in information from visuals. So those things really work. Let's have a look at what you might do with visuals, and congratulations to everybody who sent through the correct date. There's quite a few of you. This is a hand-drawn visual that I would use in a face-to-face meeting, but you see this has been turned into a picture, it's been photographed and processed, and here it is in our webinar session. So you can do that as well. You can have hand-drawn things that you bring in. And can you see it's really quite interesting? This is something that you could use for retrospective or lessons learned, using a metaphor of a garden, you know, what's growing well, a compost bin for the things you want to throw away, and so on. The veg garden down here that needs work. So yes, things like this will engage people and hook them in. Here's that picture. This is a group I was working with. In fact, we were helping Stephen Thorpe down here to get his PhD, and he's now a senior lecturer in Auckland. So yes, we used this. We were a virtual team working on his idea that stories in narrative form would be very powerful to engage people virtually. And I was part of that research group. So we're getting near the end now, because it's coming up to the time when I said we'd stop for questions and answers. I do have a little bit of information about complexity, things like time zones, language, culture, and generations. If you'd like me to go through that rather than just cut to questions, please let me know in the chat, and I'll continue if I get people asking to cover those aspects. Okay, I've got a yes, please, all in capitals. Nobody's saying no. Oh yeah, several people saying please keep going. Okay, so we're going to spend a little time looking at when it gets harder. And this is when we add complexity. And there are these 4 different elements that I looked in quite a bit. In my book, somebody's saying, please, can we look at language barriers? Absolutely. So the things that make it particularly different are wide time zones. One of the things you can do there is to move to asynchronous working as much as possible. Another thing is to share the pain. So if you have a team, I can remember we had one team with one person in Australia and everybody else was on this side of the planet, sort of UK, Europe, and America. And we used to get up, we'd take it in turns to get up at a bad time. So we didn't always have the Australian person getting up in the middle of the night. Culture's a big one. But remember that there are different types of culture. There are functional cultures. So I've noticed that actuaries, I was working with a big insurance company yesterday in Slovakia, and actuaries as a group are very, very different from salespeople, for example. So cultural differences aren't just national. They can be functional. They could even be the company as well. People from different companies may well have slightly different cultures. But national cultures, be aware of those. One big one that I keep coming across is people saying that they're having problems working with the Middle East or India, China, pretty much most of Asia, right through to Japan, because they're not used to the concept of saving face. So again, if you need to deal with people from those countries, you need to understand these concepts that are very important. And if you ask someone to do something, don't ask a yes/no question in front of lots of people, or you might get an answer that you're not expecting. Ask people, if you want to know when people do things, ask them more open questions, maybe in a one-to-one, and go through what's needed, rather than saying, can you do this by Wednesday? When often the answer will come back, yes, whether actually that's so. Language differences. Let's look at an example. We've got Sandy saying, can we discuss language differences? Even if you speak English. Here's an example. People with English as a native language. So a South African might say, I'll do something just now, which anyone who speaks English from England or the States or Australia, Scotland, as a native speaker would probably think, well, they're about to do that. Whereas to a South African, just now means, well, if I get time. Whereas doing something immediately, they would say, I'm going to do that now. So language is complex, even when we speak the same one as our mother tongue. And it gets more complex when you have different languages. There's all sorts of ways you can make it simpler and make it less of a drain for the people who are not speaking the main language of the conference call. If you can add written, typed key messages as you go through, or just capture some of the key things, that can make it much easier for people to follow. What about transcriptions? Even translations, so that people can see the information in their own language. and even reading transcriptions is in another language is easier than listening to it often. And there are generational differences, but I have touched on that. I think because of time, I really am going to have to move on. So I'll just flash back what we've covered. And this is something for you to think about while you're coming up with questions. What do you want to do as a result of today's webinar? Because actually, unless you do something differently, you've wasted your time. What do you want to do differently as a result of today's webinar? Who needs to be involved with that? When are you going to do it by? And if you want to, you can leave a status column so you can catch up with it. So while you're thinking about your action plan, I think we can open up to questions. Is that right, Adrian?
Yeah, absolutely. Please do type in your questions. You can type them directly in the chat box or in the Q&A window if you'd prefer. And while you're doing that, I would really endorse Penny's suggestion to create an action plan. I mean, funnily enough, I know it was 2009, but I can still remember some of Penny's session from that, from that time. And I do remember jotting down some things I needed to do differently. And I found that incredibly helpful. So I would definitely endorse Penny's suggestion of an action plan. So please, we'll give you some time now to type in any questions that you may have for Penny about virtual working, virtual leadership. So please do type in the questions that you have.
There's a little picture just to say thank you very much and wondering what questions you have. If you've got suggestions on how to deal with any of the things you've talked about, please do send those in as well. I'm very aware that it's a very, very quick session. To go through all of this in a really deep way, we probably need to spend days, if not weeks.
I know it's rather unconventional, Penny, but I actually have a question I wouldn't mind asking, if that's okay.
No, not at all. Go for it, Adrian.
So Penny, I mean, I know you're very visual, and I'm probably echoing the sentiment of some, if not many, people on the call that it's quite, or I've always found it quite difficult to be as visual as you are. I really like the notation you use. I like the graphics that you use. Do you have any suggestions for people who perhaps want to start using graphics and haven't used graphics in the past?
It's interesting because I can remember when I didn't know how to do graphics and I was given a few hints and a big roll of paper and some pens, and I went away and didn't actually use it. There's something about needing to feel ever so slightly competent with graphics, and to feel confident and competent. So if there's a way that you can develop that, it's very helpful. There are a couple of things that might be useful. So one is I have a website, www.graphicsmadeeasy, which has a free 12-week course. It sends through something that would be useful for business analysts every week, and it breaks it down so it's very straightforward to draw. And for anyone who'd like to develop lots of confidence and competence, I do a one-day workshop. The next one's in June next year, but the free course will get you going if that would be useful.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Penny. And we do have a number of questions rolling in now. So our first question is from, and I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, from Andre. And his question is around facilitation. So how can you facilitate appropriately if you've got a mixture of attendees across cultures, across time zones, and you're dealing entirely in virtual?
Yeah, absolutely. Choose facilitation, choose to be a facilitative leader. Aim for a level playing field. So if you have some people virtual, some people with you, then that's do it as if everybody was virtual. If you've got people across different time zones and only some can come to your sessions, try and make it as easy as possible for them to engage. Move your meeting times around to get those people in long time zones. so that they can be involved as well. One group that I worked with had people all around the world, so practically every time zone you can imagine. What we did with them was that they split into 3 groups around time zones, and those 3 groups worked together at the same time, but they had a shared repository where everybody could look at the work that was being done at a time to suit themselves, and that worked really well as well.
Definitely. And I mean, just a random thought, Penny, of something I found useful, and it'd be good to get your view on this as well. But I found that sometimes when facilitating synchronous, whenever everyone's the same at the same time at different places, and if you've got a shared desktop but not video, what I found quite useful is, and if you've got rapport with the people, is to literally, I'll have a red card that I'll raise. So, because you get those situations where perhaps someone's monopolizing the conversation a little bit, and it's difficult to interject over a virtual meeting because you can't lean forward.
Yeah.
I found creating almost a funny metaphor for that. Have you found similar sorts of things work, Penny?
Well, actually, I tend to use a yellow card first, and then the red card is up your sleeve just in case they really get awful. But nobody's ever got to the red card for me.
Well, you see, you're far kinder than I. I go straight to the red card, but that's a great tip as well. So we have a number of questions rolling in. So the next question is from Ruan, who says he has people in Scotland and in India working on the team who don't seem to be seeing eye to eye and interacting on the project. And he suggests it's probably due to communication clash or people not understanding each other. What could you suggest there, Penny, from a sort of Indian and Scottish perspective?
Okay, so at this point, if you need to get people working together who have very strong accents, now I don't know, but around what the accents are like, but if the Scots accents are strong, then I find it difficult to understand. So are you doing some things are there things where people can, strong accents on both sides, says Rowan. Okay, so you're going to need to do something other than just audio, because audio on its own is very, very hard for people to understand. So do you have video? Add in video that will help with the understanding. You might even find that if people, if somebody from the same group, for example, another person from the Indian group can just summarize the key things in writing as people speak. So the key points are in writing, then that will make it much easier. Can you work more written? Can you modify your accents? Something that would help a lot would be to actually meet up and to get to know each other. Maybe you can't do that face-to-face in the same room, but perhaps you could do that one-on-one. Perhaps you can have, perhaps there are some within the group that are easier to understand. Perhaps they could speak to represent each of their group. You just can't carry on just pushing through and pushing through. Acknowledge the issue and get the group to come up with some ideas to help. Written can be very helpful, even if it's just having a summary on instant message or some sort of group chat, a summary of the key points being made, that can make a big difference. Yeah. Ruan's just also asked me the name of the graphical website. It's graphicsmadeeasy.co.uk.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Penny. And our next question, which is in the Q&A rather than the chat, is from Marina. And Marina says, hi, I'm a business analyst who works remotely from business stakeholders and other BAs. What should I do if a business stakeholder asks to communicate with other BAs face-to-face rather than via chat or call, as she or he thinks this is more effective? Okay. So somebody who's quite reticent to work virtually.
Okay, so again, if you think about the different layers of communication and the different richnesses that we have available to us. In fact, this is where I'm going to start scribbling on the screen, if that's okay. So we have lots of different types of communication available. So let's say, the lowest level, a chat online. A call, an audio call would be a bit richer. In person would be much richer. You pick up much more. And then I would put video somewhere in between. People are getting more used to it. So, Marina, if you're down here, these are the options that you prefer and that are available to you easily, and your stakeholder actually prefers this in person. You can see that they prefer much richer interaction. Can you come up to use video, and perhaps your stakeholder could come down and use video? Would that be, I think that would probably work better than just chat and audio for your stakeholder, and perhaps is a way that you could do the work as a remote business analyst rather than getting another business analyst who is face-to-face to work with them. Obviously, people prefer face-to-face, so that's what they're used to, and you can pick up so much more. It is richer, so it's probably easier to do a great job as a business analyst if you have that face-to-face interaction. Can you try and get to know your stakeholders as well, and engage them and find some connection with them as well? Think about those different identity aspects. Can you find some common ground? Because then it will be much easier for people to connect and to enjoy working with you.
Fantastic, really useful advice there, and the visual you've just drawn there is so illustrative of that, so thank you very much, Penny. We have time for one final question, a really quite pertinent question, and one that I suspect you've heard more than once, comes from Sandy. And Sandy says, when you're drawing, how do you maintain the serious intent of the session? And I know what you mean, Sandy, because sometimes people sort of assume or associate, sketches with things that are less serious. So any advice on that, Penny?
Okay, so if you think that something is poor because because it's not massively serious, actually I think the drawings are incredibly serious. The reason is that they're serious in that they work. They're not standard business practice. Having said that, very senior meetings, the sort of heads of state level and so on, they were the first ones to have people using graphics to facilitate often. And what's been happening over the last 10 years or so is that that's been percolating down and it's becoming much more common. Serious intent, if you have a serious intent to connect with people and to do serious work virtually, then you need to do what works. Graphics work, visuals work. And what I've noticed is that hand-drawn simple graphics work much more powerfully than clip art or computer-drawn graphics. There's something about humanizing the virtual workplace. It's more human. If you can create a human connection, then actually all these other questions we've had, the stakeholder doesn't want to work with you because you're remote. You've got Scottish and Indian people who can't understand each other. You've got, you need to facilitate things. In all these cases, if you can have a strong human connection and engagement, then you'll get massively serious amounts of work done, which you wouldn't if you had, in inverted commas, very serious intent, very, standard professional stuff. And I think at that point, I probably need to stop.
You do. I mean, it's a really good point, and just a point I'm dying to add to that, Penny, because I agree entirely. Is I don't know if you find the same as I, but I find sometimes very informal, low fidelity sketches are less threatening because they look less final. So you can play around with ideas with pen and paper. But the moment, or I find as a BA, the moment I put it in Visio, people assume it's the finished article. So there's something nice. There's something nice about pen, paper, and low fidelity.
And to build on that, Adrian, I'm going to jump in, which you probably don't want me to because we're probably over time. Is search on Modern Analyst, I think. No, BA Times. Search on BA Times for Kim Quirk. And if you put my name in as well, you'll see what she did when she changed a very, serious intent Visio diagram of a BPMN process when she just added some small hand-drawn sketches. She'd been trying to get stakeholders to agree for 6 weeks. They agreed in under an hour.
Fantastic. So Penny, thank you so much. I'm sure people will want to stay in touch with you. Are you able to let people know how they can connect with you and contact with you?
Absolutely, thank you very much. This is my phone number, my email address, my website, my Twitter. And also, if you're interested in this, obviously we've not had huge amounts of time. It's felt, like a sort of skim across the surface. There is much more in my book. And what I've done for you there is there's a coupon, VLF20. And if you use that at Kogan Page, you not only get 20% off, but if you're in the UK or the US, where Kogan Page are based, then you will also get it posted to you for free as well.
Fantastic. And if you're not familiar with Penny's book, I find Penny's style really engaging and practical. So do take a look at that. So Penny, if I could just have the final slide. The only thing left for me to do is to say a massive thank you to you, Penny, for presenting. Really engaging, really interesting session. So thank you so much for taking the time out. I'd also like to thank everyone who has dialed in and been part of this webinar, because as Penny mentioned, you were active participants throughout. If you've enjoyed this webinar, I would encourage you to take a look at some of our other upcoming webinars. And also, you will be getting a survey in probably later this evening. It's really, really quick. It's just 3 questions. We're really keen to know what you liked, what you didn't like, and also whether you've got ideas for topics that you'd like to see in future webinars. So once again, thank you very much for dialing in. Thank you, Penny, and have a very good afternoon, evening, depending on where you are in the world. Thank you.